Yeah, so a good afternoon to Professor Catherine Stevens, that is joining us all the way from Canada to Brazil. Uma boa tarde, turma. Que estamos aqui abrindo, então, né, o nosso primeiro intergrupo, eu e o professor Anísio, primeiro intergrupo, nosso encontro aberto, então, dos grupos de pesquisa formados pelo grupo de pesquisa Colisão de Direitos Fundamentais e o Direito como Argumentação, e o grupo de pesquisa Desafios Contemporâneos no Direito Público, em que temos a alegria, então, de contar com um paper, a comunicação a partir de um paper escrito pela professora Catherine Stevens em temas que interessam aos dois grupos, acerca da temática da humildade como uma virtude necessária na tomada de decisão no common law, ou no original, humility as a necessary virtue in common law decision making. Thank you very much again, Professor Kat, to find a time, a place in your schedule to bring to Brazil your research and your thoughts on the matter. And we are thrilling. We are very anxious to hear from you these new ideas, and we gather some feedbacks and thoughts on our students from the weeks that had followed this event, and the feedbacks is the most well expected. It's very thoughtful examination on this matter that in Brazil it's not common. It's uncommon to have something like humility as a topic of studies in philosophy or in decision making, law decision making. So it's very good to have the source, the main source of these ideas with you today. So I don't know, Professor Anísio, se gostaria de falar algumas palavras para abrirmos o evento.
Just to welcome Professor Catherine Stevens. We are truly honored by your presence and grateful for your opportunity, as Lucas said, to engage with your remarkable work on judicial virtue and legal reasoning in the moral legitimacy of education. Your reflections in this article have deeply inspired our research and resonate strongly with the Brazilian debates on constitutional reason and judicial ethics. So welcome to FMP, Professor Stevens, and it's a real privilege to have you with us in this opportunity. Thank you very much.
That's quite wonderful. So, Professor Stevens, if you may please have the floor, and we'll be here listening carefully to your words.
Thank you so very much for having me. When you reached out, Lucas, you said you wanted to, you asked whether I had a talk that I could give that had to do with roles and judicial reasoning. And I thought, I know that it's called humility, but I hope that it will become clear soon why I thought that this was appropriate with respect to roles. So I'll start my PowerPoint. I hope everybody can see that. And then I'll go through the talk. Can you all see this?
Yes.
Perfect. So I'll start the slideshow. Okay. And you can all hear me well. So I'm sorry. Okay, yeah, perfect.
Very well.
Okay. So in the kind of literature on judicial virtues, there's a kind of canon on what the most important judicial virtues are. And so being law-abiding and so on are usually in that canon. Humility, even though it's been discussed a little bit now in the virtue jurisprudence literature, usually doesn't get onto the central judicial virtues list. At least not generally. And what I want to do today is basically make the case that we should put it there, that judicial humility should get a place on the central judicial virtues list. At least I want to make the case for common law jurisdictions. This doesn't mean that I don't think that it shouldn't be an important virtue in civil law jurisdictions. It just means that my considerations have to do specifically with reasoning by precedent and how that works. And that's why the argument that I make is strongest for common law jurisdictions. Why do I think that humility should be on the central judicial virtues list? Well, because I think that humility is necessary in certain ways, both counterfactually and causally, for a fully justified common law decision. And so there's a little bit to unpack here in this claim. So when I say a fully justified common law decision, I mean not just one that is justified kind of from the point of view of the law, that it's in accordance with the law as it already exists, but I mean also from the point of view of political morality. I assume in this paper that having a common law system in the first place is justified. If it's not justified, then from the point of view of political morality, you couldn't justify any common law decisions. So I'll assume that it's justified to have a common law. And my argument will be that you need humility, both causally and counterfactually, for making fully justified common law decisions. By both causally and counterfactually, what I mean by that is you need humility actually in the mix for it to be a fully justified common law decision. So it needs to actually play a causal role in how the decision comes about. That's the causally part. And it needs to be the kind, like the decision needs to be the decision that a humble judge would have made too. That's the kind of counterfactual part. So if it's not made by a humble judge, then it needs to be the kind of decision that a humble judge would have made. Okay, so that's why I think that humility should be on the central virtues list, because you need it for fully justified common law decisions. Now, obviously, that's a big claim and needs to be justified. So here's how I'm going to try and go about justifying this claim. First, I'm going to give you the conception of humility that I'm using. I'm going to basically do what philosophers always do at the beginning and cheat by finding a conception of humility for which what I want to say is true. And then I would claim that, or I would kind of elaborate on the fact that common law judges just de facto have a lot of power over the content of the law, and specifically over the legal judgments, over the legal subjects that stand before them. Then I will argue that having the common law and giving judges this type of power is justified by a combination of rule of law values and values of fundamental justice. And then I will say, and so therefore, when judges make common law decisions, they should take these two types of values into account. And then I will argue that humility, in the kind of humility that I'm interested in here, is necessary for realizing the appropriate balance between these two values, because they can pull into different directions. And then in the last third of the talk, I will try to show that humility is necessary counterfactually for the individual judge, as in each individual judge needs to make decisions that a humble judge would have made, and causally for the entire judicial community. So a vicious judge can make fully justified decisions if they are the kind of decision a humble judge would have made, if they are embedded in the correct way in a judicial community that is itself humble. And then I will try to explain, because obviously that needs to be explained, what it's supposed to mean to say that a community of judges is humble. And that will be the talk. Okay, so first I want to talk about the kind of conception of humility I'm using here. So there is a kind of disagreement in the virtue literature on whether humility is even a virtue. And that's because some conceptions of humility show it as self-underestimation. So a person is humble if they think of themselves as worse than they actually are. And this is kind of how we sometimes use the word humble in kind of normal general interaction, right? Someone thinks of themselves as less talented than they are, and we say, oh, they're so humble. Against this, people have put a different conception of humility that kind of is supposed to hit the Aristotelian mean, right? The Aristotelian mean conception of humility says a person is humble if they have a correct estimation of how good or bad they are. They hit the spot on their self-estimation. They do this correctly. And the reason why we call this humble is because people in general tend to overestimate themselves. So, right, kind of against the general population, a person who correctly estimates herself will appear to be less full of herself than other people. So we call that humble. So I will go with the humility as correct self-estimation understanding. The other two ways that you can understand humility is, first of all, when we are humble, we can be concerned with our own personal attributes. So I can be humble about how smart I am, or I can be humble about how generous I am. The other way that we can be humble is we can be humble with respect to the place that we occupy within the larger kind of set of relationships in which we are. So one way that we can think of humility in this relational sense is when we say that someone knows their place, right? They know what kind of role they occupy and what that role demands of them, and then they fulfill that role according to those demands, even when they are in a position where, for example, they could use the power they have in other ways that go against those role demands. I will be here interested mostly in the type of humility that has to do with relationships, though the other kind of humility, the kind of humility that has to do with your own personal attributes, plays a role. But I'm mostly interested here in humility as a type of knowing your place. So humility, as I'm interested in here, is a kind of correct estimation for what the place that we occupy in the broader set of relationships requires of us and how we should act within them. And so for judges, this can be translated into the humble judge appropriately conceptualizes her role and her relationship to other legal subjects as one of service. She's aware of her power over legal subjects and motivated by the associated responsibility to use it correctly. So the humble judge knows that she has a lot of power over the legal subjects that come before her, but she also knows and acts on the fact that she has been given this power so that she can serve those legal subjects. Okay. So now I want to kind of start, now that we've kind of laid out what I will mean by humility, I want to start trying to justify why it is necessary for making fully justified common law decisions. And the first step in that justification is to just point out how much power, de facto power, judges in common law systems actually have. So here's a kind of commonplace that's worth repeating. The common law is judge-made law. By that, I do not mean that like judges make statutes the way that legislatures make statutes. Rather, I mean that because the common law is built through the mechanism of precedent, this mechanism creates an environment in which every common law decision that judges make contributes to what the common law is. Now, importantly, no one single common law decision will ever create a fully formed, finished unit of law by itself, but every common law decision will in some way contribute to what the common law as a whole is. And almost every common law decision allows for some discretion, however minute that bit of discretion might be, right? But almost no common law decisions ever allow for free-for-all discretion. Like it almost never happens that a judge comes across a common law place where there's absolutely no law at all constraining the decision. So I'm sure you all know this, but like just as a quick overview of all the ways that judges can have discretion when they make common law decisions, right? Judges have discretion when they interpret the opinions of earlier judges, right? There's almost always in the interpretation of what law that has been enacted through precedent might mean, some little bit of discretion involved. Judges can distinguish when, right, the common law or the systems of precedent allow distinguishing, which means that a judge, even when they have a precedent case that is applicable, if they find that the case before them is relevantly different from the precedent case, they can say that they will not repeat the decision in the precedent case and instead make a different decision. And since we all know that any two things are both similar and different in many regards, there's always some way, however implausible it is, that you could claim that two things are different. Further, judges can extend precedents. So even if a precedent case doesn't seem to be immediately applicable to a new case because, let's say, it has features that the new case doesn't share, it is possible in the common law to extend precedents and say, actually, you know what, this feature isn't that necessary after all, I'm going to extend this, and now this precedent decision will also be repeated in this new case. And then finally, some courts have the ability to overrule, but obviously not all courts, because that depends on where courts stand in the hierarchy of the court system. So what this all comes down to is that in the kind of development of the common law, no judge ever has the last word on what the common law says, because their precedents can be interpreted, distinguished, extended, and so on. But every judge gets some word in, and how impactful that word is depends on a lot of factors, but some impact is always there. According to Le Monde, there's even an impact when you just follow a precedent, since following a precedent kind of communicates that the differences that you might have found between the new case and the precedent weren't important differences. So that also kind of enriches the common law further. This leads us to kind of two kind of unsurprising corollaries about what kind of power common law judges de facto have. First of all, because of this, the common law could develop to reflect the moral and political opinions of the community of judges. And that means that judges can use their common law decision-making to influence the moral and political content of the common law. It is kind of conceivable that a judge might say, I want the common law to go into this direction. And therefore, now every time I have discretion, the only thing I will aim at is to push it as far into that direction as I possibly can. Now, that would not be virtuous behavior, but it is possible to kind of conceive of a judge who does that and does it without ever kind of going against positive law. And second, because the kind of ways in which judges have discretion in the common law is so complex, it's incredibly difficult for a legal subject, especially because legal subjects usually don't themselves have kind of legal education, to completely foresee whether their particular case will be one in which discretion plays a large role, right? It's difficult to make absolutely sure beforehand that discretion won't play a large role, right? So legal subjects cannot kind of reliably determine whether the use of discretion was or was not afterwards warranted. You will often have cases where afterwards kind of commentators say the judges overused their discretion, but this is not something that can be definitely proven, right? This can be argued about, but not definitely proven. So legal subjects are not in a position where they can be absolutely sure beforehand whether discretion will play a large role. And judges are in a position where they theoretically have the ability to decide that they want to use the discretion that they have in order to further their own ideas about where the law should go. I will talk, by the way, legal subjects can, of course, appeal judicial decisions and therefore kind of bring it to later judges of whether there was an abuse of discretion there. And I will talk about that later. But even when they do that, right, you go into appeal, but you don't know whether you're going to win the appeal. So it's kind of unsurprising, but what the picture that I was trying to paint was common law judges, because of the way that precedent works and the way that discretion is used in precedent, just have a lot of de facto power over the legal subjects that stand before them. Okay. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk a little bit about how rule of law values and values of fundamental justice work together to justify adopting a system of stare decisis and giving judges this type of power. So the rule of law, based kind of to give a kind of overview description of what the rule of law requires, the rule of law says that people should be ruled by the law and not by other people. They should not be subjects to the will of powerful individuals. They should be able to form reliable expectations about how the state will react to their actions, without having to make predictions about the psychology of the powerful, right? So the rule of law is supposed to be the opposite of the rule of kings, for example. If you're ruled by a king, the way you're going to figure out what's going to happen to you if you do action X is you ask yourself whether the king is going to like it. The rule of law is supposed to prevent you from being in that situation. By kind of demanding this, the rule of law is supposed to protect incredibly important values, namely values like autonomy and dignity, right? The rule of law makes the law predictable, predictable in a way that doesn't depend on you really knowing the person who has power over you really well. So and that is how it furthers autonomy, right? It allows legal subjects to plan their life without having to be afraid to get thwarted by unpredictable authorities. They can get thwarted by predictable authorities, right? They can know that there's rules that will prevent them from doing something, but the idea is that they will know this beforehand, and that authorities will have to act according to these known rules. And it protects dignity and equality because it protects legal subjects from becoming subject to individualized direct power from other individuals, which would undermine their equality and thereby humiliate them, right? Because there is no one, or the rule of law forbids that there's anyone whose psychology you have to predict in order to know what happens to you. It makes it so that even if someone has the decision-making ability over you, so the judge, for example, that they are still your equal in that they stand under the law together with you. They have to enact the law on you. They don't get to enact what they want. So that is why the rule of law is so important. And rule of law values play a really central role in the justification of adopting the principle of stare decisis. The idea here is that because language is kind of a rough tool, and because human affairs are incredibly varied, it's basically impossible for legislators to create statutes that are at the same time precise enough to give legal subjects an idea of what's going to happen to them in any given situation, and kind of simple enough that legal subjects could possibly understand them, right? This is what kind of Schauer describes when he talks about the over and under inclusivity of all rules. You can't make a rule that will kind of deal with every eventuality and is simple enough that anyone could possibly still understand it. And therefore, there will always be cases in which judges have discretion, right? There's always going to be cases where the rules aren't clear on what should be decided in this case. And the idea is that stare decisis furthers predictability by reducing the number of cases in which judges must use this discretion every single time that one of these happens, right? Every time one of these cases happens, the judge uses discretion now, but if they happen again, discretion doesn't need to be used again because the precedent carries this decision forward towards relevantly similar cases. Therefore, the need for predictability contributes to justifying the adoption of stare decisis. So stare decisis is also necessary for the preservation of equality and the avoidance of humiliating the use of power. And this is because the system of precedent and the system of stare decisis requires judges to reason or to think of themselves as members of the court when they make decisions over legal subjects, right? Instead of thinking of themselves as individualized persons with preferences and so on, they think of themselves as members of the court, and they must treat all the decisions that the court has made before they came across this case as correct decisions. So they are required to utilize all the guidance that the law can give and make this apparent and acknowledge that earlier judges were following the law in their precedent decisions. So they have to preserve the dignity-affirming equality that kind of contributes to the justification of stare decisis in every decision by doing this and making clear to the legal subjects that their decision is kind of bound by everything that the law has to offer to them, thereby reducing the amount of their own personal input into the fate of the legal subjects as much as they possibly can. These are two requirements, right? The first requirement is that judges reason or try to reason from a legal point of view as much as possible, and that they make it apparent that they have done so to the reasonable legal subject, so that the reasonable legal subject can know that the decision that was made about them was one that wasn't personal, but rather one coming from the law. Now I can't see my own slide. Right? Oh, this is important, right? And by reasonable legal subject, I mean a normally functioning person, not Plato's kind of person in the Platonic heaven who can understand things even if they're not explained to them, right? So the judge has to make this clear in a way that the average person can understand or see. Okay. I think that these rule of law values are so central in the justification of adopting stare decisis that if the common law fails to realize them, it's just not justified at all anymore. And this is because, right, judge-made law is law made by people who haven't been democratically elected. So if you believe that democracy is the correct way to make law in general, you need a pretty good justification for accepting that law can be made in another way. And I think that if these kind of the rule of law connected reasons are not fulfilled, then there's just not strong enough reasons to support this type of non-democratic lawmaking. But the justification for having a system of binding precedent that creates law, and therefore giving judges the common law associated de facto power, must influence how judges then use that power, right? It influences what good reasoning towards common law decisions look like from the point of view of political morality. If the reason why judges get this type of power is because it justifies rule of law, it realizes rule of law values, then in their use of that type of power, they have to aim at realizing rule of law values and not away from it, if that makes sense. So rule of law values play a role in what counts as fully justified common law decisions. And again, fully justified here means fully justified from the point of view of political morality, not just from the point of view of the law, which means that even when a judge finds themselves with discretion, when they realize that they can either distinguish or not distinguish, and that the law doesn't direct them, right, that the positive law doesn't force them into one direction or another, they have to take into account the fact that they have this discretion because they're supposed to further predictability, dignity, and equality in this specific manner. Okay. The need to make law predictable and to allow reasonable subjects to see that their cases have been decided by the law and not by the personal will of the judge then requires that judges give appropriate weight to the reasonable expectations of legal subjects, even when they legitimately use discretion, right? If a judge realizes that the positive law here gives them discretion, say to distinguish or not to distinguish, they should consider what the reasonable expectations of the legal subjects probably are about how the case will go, because continuously disappointing reasonable expectations makes it harder and harder for legal subjects to feel like, and actually do, predict what outcomes will be, and will make them more and more likely to feel that they are under the personal power of individualized judges. But things are not so simple that any common law decision that realizes rule of law values is kind of automatically fully justified from the point of view of political morality. It's not so simple that a judge, every time that they have discretion, could just say, okay, I'll see what these legal subjects reasonably expect I'll do, and then I'll do that, and that make it fully justified. Now, why is that not the case? Because rule of law values can be in conflict with and can be in need of being balanced with other values important to the law. Specifically, they can be in conflict with substantial justice. So you can be in a situation where you realize that you can distinguish or not distinguish, that the legal subjects before you, given what has happened in the past and the direction that the law has been going, expect you to distinguish, and that distinguishing would be substantially unjust, and then you have a tension here, if that makes sense. Now, right, the value of substantial justice itself plays a role in justifying why we have stare decisis. Why does it do that? Because if we just wanted to have kind of rule of law values like predictability, then we could deal with the fact that legislators can't make statutes that are specific enough to deal with every eventuality. Then we could just solve that problem with gap-filling rules. So we could say one possible gap-filling rule that kind of will demonstrate what I want especially well would be to say something like, every time there's a legal case and the judge figures out that the law isn't clear on it, all parties go to jail for a year. Now you have kind of complete predictability, right? There is no further gaps in the law. You always have a solution. It's always right there, and it's really badly, substantially unjust. So the reason why you go with stare decisis instead of some gap-filling rule is because stare decisis allows you to tell judges when you come across one of these cases, right? Use your discretion such that substantial justice is realized, and from then on will realize predictability. So substantial justice and rule of law considerations need to work together to get you to stare decisis. If you had just substantial justice, you would just let judges decide every kind of gap case themselves. And if you had just rule of law, you would just fill this with some kind of gap-filling rule. So in order to make fully justified common law decisions, judges need to assign kind of appropriate weight to substantial justice and reasons about reasonable expectations when they have discretion. They need to figure out whether, whenever there's a tension like this, whether substantial justice is more important or protecting reasonable expectations is more important. And only when they kind of weigh this correctly do they come to fully justified common law decisions from the point of view of the law and political morality. Now, what does all of this have to do with humility? So we could now say, okay, we're going to just try and figure out whether we can create a system of authoritative rules about how judges should balance these two values when they come to a point where they have to. But the problem is that if you create such a system of authoritative rules, you've taken the discretion away that we have just so carefully justified, right? These kinds of authoritative rules would just be another version of those gap-filling rules, and that would mean that you kind of let go of the substantive justice idea. So we can't have these authoritative rules. What then can a judge use in order to figure out how they should weigh like the need for predictability against the need for substantial justice? Well, remember that I kind of front-loaded my conception of humility here and said that the humble judge appropriately conceptualizes her role and her relationship to legal subjects as one of service. She's aware of her power and motivated by the associated responsibility to use it correctly. In other words, like a humble judge tries to make their decisions in accordance with their role. So the only thing that at this point can help a judge reason through how to balance predictability versus substantial justice is to have an appropriate understanding of what the judicial role requires of them. And this understanding provides them with the basis on which judges can then determine the appropriate weight of these types of reasons on a case-to-case basis. In other words, a judge who sits there and asks themselves, well, I think that doing A is substantially just. I know that these legal subjects expect me to do B, will need to put in their understanding of the judicial role in order to give appropriate weight to what they consider substantial justice to require of them and what those legal subjects expect of them. The appropriate understanding of the judicial role, its relationship to other legal subjects, and the extent and responsibility of judicial power then is necessary for the correct application of weights to reasons when exercising discretion. You need to understand what you're supposed to do with the power in order to do it correctly. And that understanding is a product of judicial humility. Humility here, again, understood as knowing your place, knowing where you are and what you're supposed to do in the web of relationships. Though humility, by the way, also kind of contains to be appropriately motivated by this place that you know, right? You're not humble if you know what your place is, but you don't care about it very much. The de facto power that judges possess kind of tempts them to what is generally called in the virtue literature arrogance. And arrogance would be expressed by overvaluing the weight that your own perception of substantial justice should get in the legal system, right? So you have power over these legal subjects, you want to make a decision, you realize they expect one thing from you, but you're sure that they're wrong about what substantial justice requires, and you have the power to make what you think substantial justice requires happen. Is if you do not give any weight or not appropriate amounts of weight to their expectations, then you are arrogant, because you put your own conception of what should happen in the law above your role as a judge. You treat yourself as an aspiring legislator, in a sense. If you overcompensate for this, then that results in what the virtue literature would call self-abasement, which would lead judges to completely undervalue the weight of their own perceptions of substantial justice, and that would lead them to shirk the responsibility that they carry as a part of the judicial community as a whole, right? The judicial community as a whole has this responsibility to fill gaps with substantial justice. Otherwise, we could have gap-filling rules. And every time a judge has discretion, they carry some of that responsibility on their shoulders. Undervaluing how important their perception of substantial justice is would mean shirking that responsibility. So humility stands between this type of arrogance and this type of self-abasement. So humility as the correct understanding of the judicial role and judicial responsibility is the basis for a correct way. That is why humility is necessary here. But what kind of necessity is this? And I will explain why I'm asking that question right away. So Amalia Amaya distinguishes two different ways in which virtue can be necessary for good decision-making. There's a counterfactual version, according to which a legal decision is justified if and only if it is a decision that a virtuous legal decision-maker would have taken in like circumstances. And then there's a causal version where a legal decision is justified if and only if it has actually been taken by a virtuous decision maker in exercise of their virtue. Amaya argues that we only need counterfactual virtue in order to make legal decisions justified. And her kind of justification is this: if someone committed a murder, then convicting them of murder is the justified decision. And this is so whether or not the justification for the decision was motivating the decision. So, for example, let's say that convicting those who are actually guilty of murder is what virtuous judges would do. And let's imagine a completely vicious judge, and they get bribed to convict the murderer of murder, and they do it just because of the bribe. That doesn't seem to change that it's the right decision to convict the murderer. Does that make sense? So Amaya argues, so what we actually need is just counterfactual virtue. It's just that you make the decision that the virtuous judge would have made. If it's not actually made out of virtue, that doesn't take anything away from the correctness of the decision. Does this also work for humility and common law decision-making with precedent? Okay, so let's kind of imagine a vicious judge who's not humble at all. And she's motivated mainly by advancing her career. So she's not interested in fulfilling her role well or carrying her share of the responsibility for just law. She just wants a big car and a big house. So she knows that her career depends on the opinion of her peers, and she's also incredibly smart and really good in social reasoning. So she can guess what other judges would have decided. And she works in a jurisdiction that is saturated with humility. Around her, all the judges are humble. And so all the people who make decisions about her career advancement are also humble and are going to reward decisions that look exactly like humble decisions. And so she reliably makes decisions that a virtuous, humble judge would make. And the result of this, right, of her being motivated mostly or only by her career, but surrounded by people who are humble and make decisions about her career, is that she makes predictable decisions with opinions that give reasonable subjects good reason to believe that they are being ruled by the law and not by the judge, right? It seems like what this tells us is that you also only need counterfactual virtue in kind of common law decision making, because our vicious judge seems to fulfill all the things that we need. But, right, the rule of law kind of requires a little bit more than that legal subjects are fooled into thinking that they're being ruled by the law. The rule of law requires that legal subjects are actually ruled by the law and not made subject to individual power. And this is also an important part of the justification of stare decisis. So aren't the subjects that stand before our vicious judge really kind of subject to their personal power? Because if the vicious judge determined that a vicious decision this time would further her career, she wouldn't hesitate. She would make the vicious decision, right? The only thing that keeps her back is that she's afraid of the opinion of her humble colleagues. What follows from this? We could say something like, oh, what follows from this is that we actually need causal virtue, right? The only fully justified decisions are the ones that are made by humble judges. But I don't think that's true, because I think that there actually is, in the kind of counterfactual that I built, a causal connection between humility and the decisions that our vicious judge renders, right? The humility is not causally effective in the vicious judge, but it is causally effective through the vicious judge. Because the vicious judge acts the way they do because the people around them are humble and they try to please them. So we can say something like, the reason why these decisions that the vicious judge makes seem justified is that a threshold amount of at least moderate humility is there in the judicial community and influences the vicious judge's decision making. And that kind of leads me to saying, we need a threshold amount of at least moderate humility that is causally necessary for the judicial community. Why? Because humility in the community then becomes a causal factor in the counterfactually humble decision of even vicious judges. The way that you make sure that even vicious judges will make counterfactually virtuous decisions is by surrounding them with humble judges and creating a system in which the existence of the humble judges ensures that the vicious judge makes the good decisions. And this happens, for example, through the way that judges are taught in law schools, how their careers progress, what will earn them advancements and perks of all kinds, even how they think about fundamental justice is influenced by what other judges and members of the legal community think. So you can build a legal community such that even vicious judges in that community will only advance to power and then will only be able to keep that power if they keep making these counterfactually virtuous decisions. Also, because if they are in a humble community, like in a sufficiently humble community of judges, legal subjects can escape the vicious judges through appeal, for example, and move to situations where they will be judged according to the law, which means that since they have the power to go on appeal, are not actually under the personalized power of an individual vicious judge, because moving on, having the power to go to appeal means having the power to move into a situation where it is again the law that decides and not the judge. Without community humility, legal subjects are subject to the personal power of judges and not the law, and that undermines their dignity. The common law then fails at realizing one of the values that justify it. So if you imagine a community of vicious judges and that make common law together, then every single time, since the vicious judges do not care about fulfilling their role responsibilities or furthering substantial justice, so they do not care about making decisions according to the law, the subjects are kind of, as far as the discretion goes, under their personal power. Common law decisions made in this context undermine the justification of the common law and thereby their own justification, right? Making vicious decisions in a vicious community undermines the justification for having the power to make these decisions in the first place. So community humility is causally necessary for the full justification of common law decisions. There are two questions, and I'm almost at the end now, that I should answer before I close. The first is, what actually does it mean for a community of judges to be humble? And the second is it like what would happen if a virtuous and humble judge makes decisions in a vicious community? Could those be fully justified? So let's talk about what I mean when I say that a community of judges is humble. There are two different views on what is required for community virtue. The first one is the summative view of group virtue, where a group has a virtue if enough individuals in the group have the virtue. So you take 10 judges, you ask yourself whether that community of judges is virtuous, and you'd say something like, well, if at least 6 have the virtue, then it's virtuous. The collectivist view of group virtue works differently. It says you need a threshold amount of people to have the virtue, and then you need kind of systemic factors that inform, that connect the humble or virtuous people to the decisions that other people make in a causal way, such that the virtue has the ability to influence decision-making, not just for the virtuous individuals, but also for the vicious individuals. And that's what creates group virtue. I am a subscriber to the collectivist view of group virtue. I think that a group as a whole is virtuous only if, first of all, a threshold number of people in that group are virtuous, and second of all, the group is organized in such a way that the virtue of the virtuous people influences sufficiently the decision-making of the vicious people. And that's what I claim is causally required for fully justified common law decisions. The second question I want to answer is whether fully virtuous, humble judges could make fully justified common law decisions in a vicious community. And I'm not entirely sure on this one, but I think not. And I have 3 reasons why I suspect not. I suspect it's actually just required that the community is as a whole humble. First of all, a vicious community of judges will likely create a common law that does not appropriately reflect substantial justice. Since they don't care about substantial justice in the correct way, they will create a common law that reflects whatever they prefer the law to look like. And so even virtuous judges in such a vicious community have to rely on a fundamentally unjustified common law, right? The whole common law is unjustified. The virtuous judge can't change that through their virtuous decision-making. Excuse me. Second, in a vicious community, legal subjects have reason to suspect that any judge that they come before is a vicious judge, and that they are therefore under that judge's power. So they are just basically never justified to believe that it was the law that decided their case, insofar as discretion was involved, and not the personalized judge. And therefore they are always in the humiliating situation of having to think about, right, what the psychology of this judge tells them will probably happen. Since this is humiliating and undermines dignity, it does this even if the judge just by luck happens to be virtuous. And finally, the virtuous judicial community adds kind of an element of non-arbitrariness to the connection between the justifying values that justify having stare decisis in the first place and each and every single legal decision, right? The community humility is like a leash that will keep even a vicious dog at bay, if that makes sense. In vicious communities, the legal subject is kind of subject to arbitrary power, even when she happens to encounter a virtuous judge, because the virtuous judge, should they turn vicious, could then start making vicious decisions, right? In the virtuous community, the ways that the community is organized and distributes power will keep vicious judges at bay. So whether a single judge changes their character from virtuous to vicious or back doesn't make a difference for the legal subject. In a vicious community, when the legal subject stands before the virtuous judge, they know that if that virtuous judge had a bad bagel for breakfast, there's nothing keeping them from making a vicious decision. It's like having a good monarch, knowing that if the monarch has a bad day, they could do horrible things to you. So these are the 3 reasons why I suspect that even a virtuous, a humble judge in a vicious community couldn't make fully justified common law decisions. Now, why is this last bit interesting? I think it's interesting because it suggests that, and I think this overall, but I think this is just one further reason, it suggests that the idea that we could create systems that generate justice independent of the goodness of the individuals in it is just not right, right? I think it's probably impossible to generate a kind of formal system in which the structures guarantee that there will be justice even if all the people working in it are vicious individuals. But that's just kind of a further thought. Thank you so very much for listening for this long, and I'm really looking forward to the discussion.
Well, so thank you very much, Professor Catherine Stevens. It was really, really amazing. It was very mind-blowing in some ways for us in Brazil. We just received a conference, not in our faculty, but in our city, Porto Alegre, from Professor Claudio Michelon, that I think you have met in Edinburgh, yeah. And Claudius make a statement without any fear to say that in Brazil, the Supreme Court judges are making a role of legislators. So this is kind of a necessary matter for us to discuss. And so thank you very, very much for your paper and for your thoughts here, explains and exposed. And I hope you have some minutes to some Q&A. Yeah.
Yes, I would.
Thank you very much. Então, pessoal, eu vou fazer aqui um primeiro questionamento à professora Catherine. Se vocês quiserem fazer questionamentos, podem fazer em português pelo chat, em inglês pelo chat, ou simplesmente abrir o microfone e fazê-los também à professora, certo? So, Professor Catherine, just for a first question, we have met in 2021 in the inaugural ANA, Argumentation Network of America's event, with my paper on normative coherence insufficiency. Why does it not fully justify a kind remarks of our thoughts on why the things did not just fully justify law. But I was thinking, how can we manage to interconnect those ideas in a system that is also virtuous and coherent? Does coherence as a virtue helps humility as a virtue necessary in common law decision making? That would be my first thought on the matter.
I think so. I think so. The rule of law requires predictability, and it partially requires predictability because if you require legal decision makers to be predictable for the legal subjects, then they can't just do what they want to them. They have to consider what those subjects probably expect will happen. And at least one conception of coherence says that so things are coherent if they're inferentially connected, if you can understand the kind of line of reasoning that goes from one to the other. So requiring judges to make coherent decisions translates, in a sense, to requiring them to make predictable decisions, right? To make decisions that legal subjects can foresee will happen because they can reason their way to them. So I think that there is a connection there between humility and coherence, right? A judge who realizes that they have discretion and then tells themselves that they have to use that discretion in a way that is coherent with the surrounding law, thereby also makes a decision that is predictable for the legal subjects, since they have the same kinds of reasoning capacities, and therefore the judge can expect that the legal subjects could see how it's coherent for the law. Does that make sense?
Yeah, very much. I was thinking about McCormick's idea on law, on coherent law as a constrictor factor of what law intends to be, a good manner of life, and so on. So I don't know, maybe a coherent system or maybe just coherent judges would help with your last question on why we can't rely on people goodness to create a judicial system that's quite frustrating for one side, and also philosophically very fruitful to think on. So thank you for this first Eu não sei, pessoal, se vocês têm alguma, podem aí fazer uso da palavra.
Lucas, I'd like to ask something.
Yep.
I'd like to ask something about the nature and verification of humility. You describe judicial humility as casual necessary for fully justified decisions in common law. But how can a moral disposition such as humility be verified, cultivated, or institutionalized without reducing it to a mere rhetoric or falling into a circular reasoning between virtue and legitimacy?
I think that's a really good question. And I think to some extent, it goes kind of to the heart of this tension between wanting to create a system that guarantees good, just rule of law abiding decision making, and then saying you need something like virtue, which is a character trait, and that just means you need good people. And any person is going to say of themselves, I'm a good person. It's just self-defeating to claim you're not. I suspect, or in the paper, I say something like, isn't this kind of a problem that you just basically say, you're going to get good decisions out of good people, so find good people. And that's just completely unhelpful. That's like true, but not helpful. I think we can, while we probably can't do something like prove whether a single individual is humble or not, we can, on the other hand, do something like say, we will try to create an kind of an educational system that is likely to produce and reward humble individuals. For example, by making it part of the education of people in the law to think about the values that underlie the kinds of legal systems that we have adopted. So, for example, right, judges who make common law decisions should have reflected on what justifies that there is a common law rather than not, right? The reason why I'm saying this is mostly optimism. I'm an optimistic person insofar as that I think that people, when they are given good reasons, will make use of them. And so I suspect that if you take all of the law students and you teach them all about the rule of law and substantial justice and how they work together to justify the common law, a substantial amount of them will want to see the common law to realize those values and work towards this. On the flip side, if you leave this out of education and people just don't know why the common law is justified, then they also don't know what should constrain their use of power. And in general, it's more likely that people make mistakes in using power when they don't know what they have it for. So my just general hope is that we can move our legal systems towards virtue simply by giving people knowledge about the kinds of reasons that justify that the legal systems are set up that way. So is it kind of verifiable for an individual person? No, because you can't look into people's heads. We just don't walk around with signs on our forehead that says this person is courageous, but not very smart. Like, that's just not the case. But we can make these kinds of ways of thinking actionable by seeing how understanding the justifications for the way that our systems are built work can connect to then acting in accordance with those justifications. I hope that's at least somewhat helpful.
Okay, thank you very much. Sorry, but I have another question, Lucas. Professor, as I understand, your argument suggests that humility grounds on the moral legitimacy of the common law. Yet thinkers like Woodwork and Waldron warn against grounding legal authority in personal virtue rather than public justification. How does your account avoid the reintroduction moral subjectivism into legal reasoning?
So I think, at least for Waldron, I'm relatively sure that part of his worry is that grounding justice or just systems in the virtue of individual people basically just undermines the rule of law. Because if we need if you need individual good people in order to get just decisions, we're basically given and said, okay, we're going to have good kings now, if that makes sense. This is one of the motivating factors why I built in this section of the paper that talks about counterfactual versus causal virtue and tries to show that for the individual judge, we don't need causal virtue, right? And what we need causal virtue for a community of judges. So the idea is something like, if things go well and you build your community such that it is virtuously humble, this becomes a kind of self-reinforcing mechanism. So you have humble judges, they control educational systems, they educate and further humble judges, and the legal subject is more or less safe in the knowledge that they will be judged according to the law and not according to individual people. So in the way that I imagine it, it's not the case that the legal subject is ever dependent on the individual virtue of an individual judge sitting before them. Rather, they are dependent on the whole system reinforcing virtue. Now, someone like Waldron could say, but that's still a problem because these kinds of things can deteriorate. And when they deteriorate and viciousness takes over, so to say, then the legal subject becomes subject to individual power again. And to that, all I can say is, this is true of any system. Democracies can deteriorate. Some people would say that we're watching a large democracy deteriorating right now before our eyes, right? That's what the kind of last slide was supposed to suggest. There just isn't a system that you can build that is completely safe from deterioration when too many of its members become vicious. That is just a dream that cannot be fulfilled. So with this, if that's what people like Waldron would say, then I'll just say, I'll bite the bullet. We are all dependent on the goodness of others. This is part of the human condition. We can't get away from it. If what Waldron is concerned about is that what I'm saying might mean that no matter what system you're in, you're dependent on the virtue of the individual judge sitting in front of you, then I'll answer, no, you're not. What you're dependent on is that the whole system is saturated in virtue enough. So I don't know if that helps.
Okay, thank you very much.
We have a question from Vinicius. I don't know if you can read, Dr.
Oh, it's
Katz.
down there. Okay.
Yeah.
So should I just read it out loud?
There's no necessity for that.
Okay. Yeah, so I think that's right. I think that because I'm the kind of person who just believes that it's impossible to build a system of rules such that it will work independent of the kind of intentions and machinations of the individuals that use them. Right? I just do not believe that you can build a system where it doesn't matter whether people act towards vicious ends all of the time or not. I think that it is necessary that the people acting in the system get educated about the values and goals with which the system is erected. And my hope, and that's why I call myself an optimist, is if those values and goals are worthy, people will want to further them. Right? My worry is less that we will find out that we live in a state of devils. And when we educate them about the fact that the common law is justified by substantial justice and the rule of law, that they will say, great, everybody around me is stupid, so now I can do what I want and no one will stop me. But rather that if they are educated about this, the majority of people will want to preserve this. They will see why it is valuable and want to preserve this. But I do worry that if people are not educated about what the fundamental justifications for the system in which they work are, then they don't know why they should constrain their own impulses, and they won't, right? I have small children, it works much better to explain to them why they should clean their room than to just make them do it and then leave. Because if they don't understand why a clean room is valuable, the cleaning of the room will be much less effective, right? They just have no reason to do this. And so I do think that if we want to have functioning systems, we need to make sure that the people who act in those systems know what they are functioning for. What the values and virtues are that justify that they exist the way that they do. Otherwise, these people have no reasons not to abuse the system and therefore not to break it down.
Good. I would love to be skeptical, but I'm not. That leads me to another question, if I may. I noticed that Gabriel is going to make one later, but I was thinking about Dworkin's idea of a Herculean judge, and this is rather my thoughts, but from a conversation I had with an undergraduate student that is here, is José Guilherme, and he notices that maybe the Herculean model of a judge, the Dworkinian Herculean model of a judge, would be the counterpart of a virtuous judge. And I don't know if you have thoughts on that also, because if we need these cultural, community, moral justifications all the time, what is the role, again, the role of judge reasoning on judicial making? I don't know if I'm clear on the matter.
I think you let me know whether I misunderstood you. Tell me. So I think the Dworkinian judge Hercules, right, is a counterfactual imagination. There isn't a judge Hercules. There is no judge who can think and reason through all through the principles of law. But even this counterfactual judge is conceptualized by Dworkin as humble in the sense that I tried to describe it, right? Because this judge is interested in not just in what they as a private person think is just, but they're interested in what the moral principles that the law has in fact endorsed are that underlie all these smaller decisions. So they are interested in what legal subjects could reasonably expect them to do. So in a sense, so you could kind of build a Herculean judge who is not the Herculean judge of Dworkin's proportions, is basically a judge who is perfectly humble and perfectly smart and has perfect amounts of time and will therefore always come to the exactly right decision. And all their common law decisions will be completely and fully justified.
So he is morally good intended also.
Yeah, he would. I mean, he would have to be, or at least, I mean, we can also imagine a kind of, I don't know, other like evil Promethean judge, a Promethean judge, right? The Promethean judge who's incredibly power hungry, but otherwise exactly like the Herculean judge. And that would be something like a superhuman counterpart to my vicious judge, right? Who knows exactly how to advance their career and is surrounded by Herculeses and therefore does the right thing. And they would function almost like the Herculean judge, but they would only function like the Herculean judge because they're surrounded by Herculean judges, in fact. So I think the kind of Dworkinian picture works for me. It just kind of populates the judiciary with these superhuman creatures. But even then, you would get this kind of role for humility to play, if that helps at all. What did that get to your question at all?
Yeah, very much, very much. Gabriel, please.
Well, first, I would like to congratulate Professor Katerina on your research. I find your paper very intriguing, a lot of food for thought. And my question is, considering the perspective of a judge taking a decision, this necessary humility would this necessary humility translate into addressing the social expectations of the legal subjects, like to explicitly take them into consideration in the decision and arguing them with reasons of substantial justice, for example? Would that be enough to sustain this virtuous judicial community?
I suspect it would at least I'm not sure whether it would be enough in all cases, but I think it would at least be required, right? So, for example, when you look at lines of precedent, you can sometimes see what directions they go into, right? So, like you can see like this is moving towards more leniency, or this is moving away, like. In the Canadian, I like to, when I teach philosophy of law, I like to make my students look at a line of cases where you can see how decisions about when to censor move bit by bit from kind of obscenity considerations to harm considerations. And you can see it move slowly. And I make them read cases up to kind of halfway from like 1890, halfway to where we are. And then I ask them, what do you think happens next? And they always have ideas. And the ideas always go like, oh, it's been going towards harm is the most important bit for so long. The next decisions will go further in that direction. So they form expectations based on what directions the law went. They know that discretion still plays a role, but they form expectations about what direction the discretion will be used in. And they're right. I've selected this because it's predictable. So we can imagine kind of a judge who sits there and says, where the common law has been moving in a direction and the direction is good, but really what this was a slippery slope, and we've come to the point where the slope is getting dangerous. So let's say you've been making decisions about physician-assisted death, and they have been moving in one direction, and the judge says, up to now, this was fundamentally just, but if we loosen this further, it will move into the direction where it's not fundamentally just anymore. But I can see that given what direction we've been going in for this long, the legal subjects will expect that it goes in that direction further. So then you are in this situation of tension, right? You're like, so fundamental justice requires me to stop the movement, but I can see that legal subjects will expect for the movement to continue. I think that in that case, in order to kind of fulfill the requirements of humility, it would be required for the judge in the opinion to acknowledge that there are reasonable expectations here and that they are being disappointed. And this is because if they don't acknowledge it, if they do acknowledge that the legal subjects will see their reasons acknowledged and argued against. So they have the ability to understand why what happened to them did happen and how it is justified. While if they don't acknowledge it, they will have to form the impression that the judge just did what they thought was right, and that it didn't matter, that their expectations didn't in fact matter, and that they were therefore under the personal power of the judge. So I think this is, Waldron has this paper where he talks about why it is so important that judges actually write opinions in which they demonstrate that their reasoning is informed by their role as a member of the court. And his justification is you need to demonstrate this so that the legal subject can see that you didn't make the decision just as a person. And I think this is also the case in these kinds of situations. So yeah, if the balancing goes against the reasonable expectations and towards substantial justice, the judge should acknowledge where the reasonable expectations would have gone. In order to demonstrate respect for the legal subject as a reasonable being, if that makes sense. I think that's my answer.
Yeah, I find it very important. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I don't know if we have any other question.
Professor, posso fazer uma pergunta?
Yeah, of course. Sim.
Hi. I think I haven't quite grasped your answer about the working judge, because as I pose the question, I think that the Herculean model of judge developed by the working, he would be sticking to his institutional role. He would be quite breaking his institutional role in the sense that he's trying to construct a super judicial theory about legal reasoning. So wouldn't that be contrary to the idea of humility, to the idea of being humble and understanding that institutional roles have boundaries and have borders and cross lines? So that's one of the reply I could think, and it's a question I have. And the other question is, wouldn't the idea of humility and judicial reasoning and legal theory a way that virtue ethics can be united with jurisprudence? Thank you, Professor.
So I think, so the answer to the Herculean Dworkinian judge is difficult to give, because at this point there are so many interpretations of what the Herculean judge is like that it kind of depends on which one you subscribe to, how you see them. I can only give kind of the honest answer is, I was taught by Will Wolochow, and Will Wolochow's version of the Herculean judge is a version of the Herculean judge that would submit to recognizing that this legal system has adopted, has subscribed to this moral principle, and the judge doesn't like it, and they still have to go with it, right? That's basic. That's how Will Wolochow sees Dworkin's vision. But I know that there are people who kind of see the Herculean judge as less tethered to the positive law than this, and that think that, no, the Herculean judge would be able to determine whether a moral principle that a community has subscribed to is in fact a good moral principle, and would throw it out if it's not. That version of the Herculean judge isn't humble, unless we kind of reconstitute what we think the role of the judge requires. They're not humble. The Wolochow version of the Herculean judge is. I like the Wolochow version better, but I'm not going to kind of get into a fight with you about what Dworkin meant, because I'm not enough expert on Dworkin's philosophy to win that one, I guess.
Neither am I, Professor. Neither am I.
Can you repeat your second question? Because now in answering the first one, I forgot the second.
Would the idea of humility and judicial reasoning and legal theory a way so kind of virtue ethics can make a comeback in jurisprudence, so we can bring the virtue ethics developed by Ascom, Foote, and other thinkers back to jurisprudence?
Yeah, I think that is true. I think that jurisprudence has a place for virtue ethics, also for virtue epistemology. I think that these theories make valuable contributions to jurisprudence, just as they make to ethics and epistemology in general. Partially because I think so. There's Kant has this thing where he talks about rule application, right? Kant says, okay, so you have a rule, and then you try to figure out whether in this case you should apply it, and then you try to fill in a rule that tells you how to do the application, but you get the same question again, and then you get an infinite regress, and at some point you just have to make judgment. I think that what comes in there, into that gap, is virtue theory. Right, this is why I decided to talk about humility specifically when it comes to discretion in the application of precedent. Right, that's where it comes in, particularly because you get into this infinite regress of making rules about the application of rules, and on and on and on, and you will never get it just right. The gap always remains. So I do think that virtue theory has a place in jurisprudence. And therefore, I guess it follows kind of from all that I have said, it follows that we should teach all law students not only jurisprudence, but also virtue theory.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you very much.
Yeah, and we hope so. I don't know if we have any last questions, but I think it is quite enough for the goodwill of Professor Cat here with us today. So I would like to on behalf of our faculty, FMP, to thank you very much once again, Professor Katerina Stevens. It was very good, very wonderful to hear from you, your ideas, your thoughts on argumentation as a topic and humility as an idea that is so important for us here in Brazil. I hope to hear from you on further papers, further researches. I don't know if you have any newsletter that we can subscribe in, but if you do, I'll be subscribed. And I pass to Professor Anísio if he wants to make statement final, professor, se quiser, para que nós possamos
Thank you for
encerrar.
Professor Catherine. It's amazing lecture. It's a great opportunity for everybody. So thank you very much, Professor Catherine.
Thank you so very much for having me. It was a great honor to be invited to speak. Thank you. I really, really appreciate it. I'm very grateful.
We are. Então, pessoal, muito obrigado pela assistência. E qualquer situação, nós estamos também à disposição ali pelos canais de contato. Professor Catherine, once again, thank you very much and
Thank you.
goodbye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.